Oh god. Wait, doesn't Stalin like think that I'm a pro-capitalist or something?
Yeah, he thinks you're a dirty compromiser.
Oh god. Okay, that's gonna be interesting.
This is gonna be interesting.
Well, I'm gonna have to try to explain that social democratic ideology and social democracy as a policy regime are different things. Something which MLs tend not to understand, unfortunately.
Yeah, they like it all to be like, we're gonna say we're gonna do this thing, and then we're just gonna do that thing. Like it's very like it is very Leninist.
I mean, uh, I heard like there many of the Marxists during Lenin's time were like, what he is doing is not in line with Marxism.
Yeah, that's why Marxist Leninism is its sort of its own ideology, because Lenin wrote his own theory. Like he expounded on Marxism to his own version of it. So the orthodox Marxists were critics of it.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, it ended pretty well. Not really.
For the historical context, I mean, the Soviet Union did actually improve people's living conditions in
Yeah,
Russia.
I mean, of course, like, if you push through industrialization, then yeah, you're gonna improve people's standard of living. Like, you're gonna end famines and stuff like that, so of course.
Yeah, but they didn't end for long.
I mean, they had a period from, I don't know, like I don't know, did they have a famine during the 40s?
I don't know when it happened.
Because the one people talk about is usually the one, like, I think it's 32, 33, with the Holodomor and stuff like that. I mean, if so,
Yeah,
they managed to keep the lack of food away from then to the 80s.
true. And wasn't the Holodomor like by design, like they purposefully starved people?
I mean, that's argued. I mean, some claim that it was designed by Stalin to essentially crush Ukrainian nationalism, and some claim that it was not, and that it was purely a result of natural causes like disease spreading among the plants and a drought, which did happen actually. And well, I'd say my perception is a rapid change of farming practices from formerly private to huge collectivized production, which is a very rapid change for people to do if you do it in a couple of years. Then
Right.
you also have, of course, the fucking what's it called? Well, essentially, they thought that if you plant crops a certain way, it will grow better. In fact, it did not grow better. It was causing also the Chinese famine. And then, of course, you have the drought and all that stuff, and the taking of grain to focus it on industrial areas. Like, I mean, there's a lot that goes into it.
Of course, yeah.
I mean, I don't really tend to focus on stuff like that when I
Me
go
neither.
into like critiques. For example, like I like when some defender of Stalin comes in and being like, because one of the first things I mention when that happens is the USSR was undemocratic. They usually say, no, look at the constitution. I say, look at the law of the Russian Socialist Federative Republic, Soviet Republic. It says very, very vaguely, if you threaten the power of the party or the accomplishments of the revolution, then you are a traitor and go to prison or forced labor or something.
Right, and that's vaguely put, probably specifically so that the leaders can just kind of do that to whoever they want.
Yeah. I mean, just because you have a constitution doesn't mean that that constitution is followed.
Yeah, people should just look at America and see that one.
Yeah. Insane.
It just gets funny to me how, like, defenders of so-called ex-socialist states or current socialist states will just, like, at some point it literally just sounds like they're a conservative talking about America. It's like, it's the same shit, basically.
I mean, that's likely to be the case. I mean, I haven't made that comparison myself.
It's kind of weird because, like, people like Caleb Maupin and like that type of tank, like the China tankies, it's literally just like, we're just anti-Americanists. Like, we just, whatever's against America, like, nominally, we like that. This is basically the vibe I get. Whereas if America just, like, put a hammer and sickle on their flag and said, like, we are now the workers' state of America, like, the United Workers' Republic of America, they would just love it. Like, even if nothing else changed.
That's kind of ignoring a lot.
I mean, yeah.
Conditions.
It's ignoring a lot of their arguments.
It's ignorant. Really. That perception.
Maybe I'm being unfair.
I mean, it's not simple to go through someone else's position thoroughly, just like this.
Yeah, I'm also just trying to be entertaining.
Yeah, that's kind of a thing, right? When streaming.
Yeah. I wonder if Stalin is gonna come on.
Yeah. I could wonder. Well, I have figured that you seem very sympathetic towards social democratic ideology.
Totally, because I see it as, like, in line with my own ideology.
I am just kind of surprised because 95% of the more extreme leftists kind of hate on it.
Well, I'm okay with whatever we can do, you know what I mean? Like, I will take it. If it's left, I'll take it.
I mean, I remember I said something in the server some time ago, and I said basically if you make sure that everyone has the equal opportunity to rise within a capitalist system, would you have a problem with that system?
I don't know how much you can really guarantee equality of opportunity in a capitalist system, though.
Gift taxes, inheritance taxes, I mean, some progressive taxation, equal access, and of course, to education and stuff like that, of course. healthcare, like make sure that everyone is standing on the same ground, not that anyone due to their wealth can, or any of their friends or relatives' wealth can get ahead, really.
See, that's like so preferable to the capitalist system as it exists today that I would basically say yes. But then I think the split with other socialists is like, we don't want to just make the capitalist system livable for everybody. What we want is to move past it. So then what I would basically propose is that, like, after we got to that point, we should try to move past capitalism entirely.
I mean, yeah, democratization is also important, at least to me as a social democrat.
Right.
Like, I don't think that, you know, I don't really think that's the core of why people choose socialism. I think the core is that they think that the system is unfair to people and provide people with less, and provide the masses with less opportunity.
Well, if you don't have a robust social democratic government to keep it in check, that is what happens.
Yeah, I know. Like, so the thing is, those people would likely be content with a system that still retains basically everything with capitalism, just that you intervene to give everyone the same opportunity.
Oh yeah, like these people would
I think,
be happier under that. Yeah, because it would obviously be better unless they were just blinded and consumed by their hatred for capitalism.
like, I think that most socialists would be content with that, because the root of why most people are socialists is because they think that capitalism does not provide everyone with the same opportunity.
Right.
Because, like, I remember when I was like, I don't know, 13 or some shit, and I was like some cringe ass libertarian, and I was spinning around thoughts in my head, and the fucking deal with equal opportunity, and I was just ranting, and then just like a few sentences later, I thought like why private education would be better, and then I was like, wait, those two aren't really compatible with each other.
Yeah, definitely not. Yeah.
And that little thing kind of just started my path towards the left.
That's great.
Like, just realizing that the equality of opportunity rather than outcome, as they say, is inherent to capitalism.
I mean, I don't know about all that, but like, it's interesting how was that like the start of your politics? Was like right libertarianism?
Um, I, okay, I'll give you a rough summary of my political history. So essentially, the election in 2014. I was in 5th grade. I didn't know shit about politics. I thought that giving everyone a job sounded good, and making sure that everyone got good education and healthcare, and that with the cost of progressive taxation was fine. So in the little school election, I gave my vote to the Social Democratic Party. Then with the migration crisis, I kind of had a little reactionary period, and then I kind of got into the little conservative mess and then that moved me more libertarian, and then I started questioning that right-wing stuff, and I essentially started moving. I think I moved to some form of national syndicalism.
Oh.
So essentially, like, because I thought, well, I was like, I wanted to be an anarcho-syndicalist, but I thought, nah, that won't work because syndicals, like unions of workers, are gonna start competing with each other, like businesses do in capitalism, and then they're gonna start fighting amongst each other because there isn't any state to keep them in check. So I became a national syndicalist.
Well, national syndicalism has a weird history because that's what the Francoists in Spain called themselves before
Yeah, like
they became fascists.
it's. I mean, I wasn't a fascist because fascism is just totalitarianism. Really, like that's just what that ideology is.
Pretty much.
And then I just became a fucking commie, and then I bought into like the Marxist-Leninist mess for a bit. Then I kind of moved towards market socialism, and then I just found more of an interest in the Swedish labor movement, because like, you know, they, like in Marxism-Leninism, it's always about, you know, adapting Marxism to Russian conditions, and I thought, you know, well, maybe that's what they did here in Sweden, but to Swedish conditions. So I started getting into that, and I just became a social democrat.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. You've kind of been all over the political compass in a way.
I did a little loop, went back to social democracy from being 11 and didn't knowing anything about politics.
What's up,
Sup,
Stalin?
Stalin?
Hi, how are you guys going?
We're going good. Just
Cool.
discussing stuff.
Alright, what are you guys talking about?
We were just talking about his political evolution. He's been kind of like all over the spectrum.
Oh, alright.
Yeah, landed on some Swedish social democracy.
Okay. Cool.
I thought it
Alright.
would be interesting if you guys kind of like had one of your debates on here.
I
I
mean,
mean,
okay. I don't think I want like a full debate, but like a discussion.
yeah,
Alright.
discussions are preferable to debates.
I agree.
Like
alright.
debates, you usually just get a bunch of preparations and stuff, and
Yeah. Like, I'm not prepared for anything.
yeah, me neither.
Yeah, that's kind of what I mean, is just discussing.
Alright, sure.
Okay, so Stalin, I have noticed you hate social democracy.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, like, first of all, I think that social democracy is only possible because of imperialism. And, like, how I see it, all the gains that the working class make through, like, social democracy and, like, electoralism and such are only, like, concessions by the ruling class. They're not, like, real change. They're just, like, concessions so that, like, the working class has, like, it, like, curbs, like, revolutionary potential because a lot of people will, like, be satisfied with like, the welfare state or whatever. And like I said, with imperialism, these concessions are made, like, on the back of, like, the third world. So I think, yeah, that's what I have to say about it.
I mean, I don't really think, like, with imperialism that social democracy is really reliant on it. Because I think, like, we have a productive capacity in the world, which is so big by this point that, yeah, we can afford the welfare state. And I also think that we're basically rich enough to afford a welfare state by this point. And so when you have imperialism, like, I also think that if you were to increase their purchasing power, their ability to exert aggregate demand, as it's called, then they would then businesses, even within a capitalist framework, would find a lot of opportunity for economic growth. And you know, if then you get a spiral with good labor movements, unions, and so on, that leads to them getting better and better conditions, better and better wages, so they can exert more and more aggregate demand. This creates essentially a growth boost, and due to our globalized economy, we will essentially find that they will boost the entire world economy by exerting more demand, having more purchasing power. So if we were to essentially help them up, we would everyone would benefit from it. And then it was in terms of reformist strategy that essentially capital just makes concessions that won't really lead anywhere. Like, I think, sure, that might be how you see it in the short term, but if you look at, like, in the long term, like, capital's power, on the political process at least, it derives from its ability to concentrate a lot of purchasing power for itself, which it uses to lobby politicians and essentially fund propaganda machines and so on. And since it has been shown historically that we have successfully redistributed the resources and increased the amount of equality, both wealth and income, in society, then we essentially also weaken their power.
Can I like add something here?
Yeah, sure.
So like, yeah, in select zones we've managed to like create more equality and like raise living conditions. But historically, like before, at the start of the Industrial Revolution, right, the workers in Europe and like America were super exploited, and they had like really bad living conditions. And like, especially in Europe, if you look at it today, like the workers have better living conditions than they like ever did before. Well, I mean, currently with like the neoliberal like reforms, it's like they're kind of stripping away like the welfare state and such, but it's like not really my point. My point is that like now, yeah, sure, like in Europe, people have better living conditions, but capitalism has also expanded to the entire world, which it wasn't necessarily like it didn't have its roots in every single country in the world before. But now it does, and it's created way more poverty than there ever was in like Europe or America. Like this is basically my main argument. I don't think that it's possible to raise the conditions of the entire world through capitalism, because the interest of the capitalist class won't allow that. Like you said, we could afford a social democracy probably for the entire world, but I like the bourgeoisie, even if they could technically afford it, it's not in their interest to like let everyone like have a like decent living standard. So that's why they probably won't do it. And like as we saw in Europe, especially because in America, like the welfare state was never really good, but in Europe, after World War II, we saw a lot of like welfare states and like measures come up to like help the working class. But recently, we've been seeing like I said, neoliberal reforms, which I don't believe that they're just like a coincidence that it's just a wave. It's how I see it. It's because the capitalist class saw the opportunity to start stripping back on like help for the workers and gain more profits. So that's exactly what they're doing. They're stripping back on welfare measures. They're privatizing so that they can make more money. It's not like just a random accident that, you know, neoliberalism just happened because no reason. It's because the capitalist class saw the opportunity to make their profit. This is especially with the like collapse of the Soviet Union, which was like the only threat really to capitalism in the world. Like when it collapsed, we started seeing a lot of these like measures being taken away because the threat of a revolution was a lot less for the ruling class. And so, like I said, they saw the opportunity to like strip back on the measures, and that's where we're at now. It's like currently going on everywhere, basically.
I mean, in terms of neoliberalism like that, I'd say that it would rather be a result of in there around 1970 and the removal of the barriers and all the international restrictions on capital flows, and the US embracing neoliberal policy to a greater extent. I mean, due to the absolutely massive dominance of capital in that country, and since it's dominant, of course, if it changes to more neoliberal policy, then the rest of the world is going to follow suit, since it was the basis of the international economic system. And so capital was allowed to internationalize more and more from the 70s onwards, while labor has not been able to keep up with this internationalization, which is why I think personally that the neoliberal wave happened.
Okay.
So I don't think it's really as tied to the fall of the Soviet Union, since we had neoliberalism develop from the 70s onwards.
Sure. Well, we saw a lot of welfare states pop up with the Soviet Union rising. That's definitely a thing.
I mean, not only was the Soviet Union rising, labor was getting stronger all over the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, during the Second World War, especially in like Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, the fascists basically took power. It was basically a reaction against the working class movement and socialism, fascism, because like the ruling class got scared of a revolution because there were strong organizations and like socialist movements like in Germany. And then so they basically just funded Hitler, and Hitler took power, crushed all the socialists, crushed all the unions, crushed all these movements, and like secured the dominance of capital. Like fascism historically was a reaction to a socialist movement. And in this, like, this is just like a dynamic which I think can be applied to other places, like after World War II in Europe, where the living conditions for the working class in Europe were raised, but like I highly doubt it was because, you know, the capitalists were feeling like, was because they didn't want like the workers to see how the like living conditions were getting better and better in the Soviet Union and other socialist countries, and see how they were like just miserable. So they wanted to like I said, curb revolutionary potential. So they instilled these measures.
I mean, in terms of fascism, I would say it was very much a reaction to the socialist revolution in Russia. I mean, They essentially got reports of millions dying due to the revolution and so on. Of course, people are gonna start getting afraid of socialism, and reactionism is of course gonna have a giant rise from seeing all that among the populace. So, I mean, I attribute some of the success of fascism and National Socialism to the revolution in Russia. Then we can I mean, the rise of the welfare state. I mean, sure, you can attribute it possibly to the ruling class, as you say, um, being afraid of a revolution themselves. But I mean, I would say that it was partly due to the crisis before World War II, the Great Depression, which saw businesses essentially not having a good time. They realized that maybe we're going to need a new economic policy to keep our profits high. We're going to need to make sure that the general population is able to exert a larger amount of demand. That means that they do need more, better wages, better conditions. They shouldn't have to pay as much for welfare, since then they can consume more, which brings up profits. Then, of course, we had with that the strengthening of essentially labor movements got stronger. Unions got stronger, which is a strengthening of labor in relation to capital.
Yeah.
So they can, of course, demand better conditions. Now they don't have to, like, the thing is, unions are usually very practical. So they don't seek these radical new ideas or something. That's usually not what workers do seek. They think of, what do I practically need within the near future?
Yeah, definitely.
So
And
that's more how I attribute it.
Okay.
I don't think it's necessarily just the Soviet Union being a threat to capitalism making. I think there's much more that plays a larger role than the Soviet Union in that.
It's not just the Soviet Union. It was also like the socialist movements inside the countries themselves.
I mean,
so, like, on the
I don't,
unions, could I like talk about this a bit? So, how I see it, unions. Wait, I have a little problem.
No worries.
Okay. So on unions, so how I see it, like, unions are good. They're like the basis of working class organization. And like you said, they are practical. They don't embrace like revolutionary ideas or radical ideas. They just like try to get like basically economic progress for the union members and like try to raise living conditions and things like that. But that's a problem with unions because it's not like a political organization like that sees the long-term interests of the working class, which is why I think the party is necessary, because that's the party's goal, to like lead the working class. And the party basically takes care of the long-term political aims of the working class.
Aren't the interests of the working class, their practical, what they see to be their practical needs, though?
The party?
No, the working people aren't like their interest, even long term, their the practical satisfaction of their needs, which is what the unions always seek to fulfill.
So, like I said, unions unions work within the system, like, while they can give better immediate like living conditions for the working class, they won't ever end the exploitation of the working class itself, or like the exploitation of man by man. It won't be done by unions, because that's not the point of unions. Unions function inside the capitalist system to like try to get better living conditions for the working class, while to truly liberate the working class from exploitation, unions aren't enough. You need a revolution to basically, liberate the working class. from exploitation.
I mean, the exploitation you're referring to, that's the Marxist perception of labor being like central production factor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
from a Marxist
I
lens,
don't buy
exploitation.
I don't buy that.
All right, could you explain why?
Because I think capital is also an essential production factor that can
Well, yes,
also
obviously.
contribute to an increased production of value.
But I don't think we have the same definition of capital, though.
I mean, capital as in means of production, what you produce with, basically.
I don't
What you use
see
to
means of
produce.
production necessarily as being capital. I could link a sort of definition, like in the text chat, if you want.
I mean, sure.
All right, I'm
We're
gonna go
gonna.
get it. It's in which book is it in?
I mean, the main point is that essentially means of production is also just as essential as labor is to
Yeah,
create
obviously,
something of
I
value.
agree.
And even then, what is created of value is subject to demand and how much people like generally want what is produced.
I mean, I don't really agree with that. I would, first of all, for Marxist economics, there's like a separation between price and value. It's like the market price is always like somewhere near the real value, but never really corresponds with the actual value of a commodity. Like the value of a commodity in Marxist terms, I think you already know this, is the amount of labor put into it, but the price is not equal necessarily with the value of the commodity itself. Like, this is kind of complicated. I don't remember everything like on hand, but I think it's pretty important to like define that. Okay, wait.
Well, I think the value of goods and services is subjective.
The value of what?
Goods and services is subjective.
I would say that the use value is subjective, but that the exchange value is objective.
Well, isn't the exchange value determined by the use value, by the one buying it?
Not necessarily. The exchange value is determined by basically the amount of labor put into it, and the use value is, I mean, I haven't read too much on this yet, but I don't think it has like, it's not measurable. I think the use value is subjective, but yeah.
I mean, because if you're gonna sell something, like, if nobody wants it, it doesn't really matter how much labor you put into it, and if you produce this just to sell, like, the thing still applies, like, so if very few like want it, or there's little, let's say, use value in it as determined by society at large, then I mean, it is likely that you're gonna have to sell it for lower than what your labor value is. Like how much it costed you to produce it. Like,
Could you might repeat, please?
Okay.
I didn't get...
Okay. So essentially, you produce your good for a price, labor, and capital, but if the use value isn't sufficient in the eyes of the consumer, then you might have to sell it for lower than that.
Sure.
Yeah, so isn't then the subjective use value the real practical thing that we should use? Like, the rest isn't really... I mean, the rest isn't really practically applicable. Like, we can't really use
commodities, are necessary for the working class or for like the property list, so they have to buy them. So like food or stuff like that, you know, like they can't just not buy it if they think the price is too high because they need to buy it.
I mean, sure,
Like I think
but by
your
this
logic
point,
applies to
that's
luxuries, but a lot of the working class can't buy these things in the first place.
I mean, I think that by this point, most consumption of even food is determined by people's taste, like their subjective determination of its value. By these days, it's not like people are usually starving, at least not in the developed world, as to say. Like, people mostly determine it by what they prefer still. It's like in the United States, for example, even like people living in the ghettos, they like throw away the food they don't like because they...
I mean, I'm not sure that applies to everyone. Like a
Yeah,
lot
but
of people can't really choose what they have, like what they can buy.
yeah, that's true.
Okay, so I put the text. It's pretty long, but it's like it comes out of Labor and Capital. It's a book by Karl Marx. It's the chapter called The Nature and Growth of Capital. It basically explains my view of, well, Marx's view of what capital is and how it isn't just like means of production. Like, I could just like read the most important part of it. It's capital does not consist in the fact that accumulated labor serves living labor as a means for new production. It consists in the fact that living labor serves accumulated labor as the means of preserving and multiplying.
Is that the most important part?
I mean, the rest is basically just explaining that.
So, essentially, like, I mean, capital is essentially accumulated labor. Like,
Yes.
you worked to be able to get more out of work later. Or, because I'm going a bit off, like, what I have read before, and like, so accumulated labor, which is capital, would be essentially labor used for future production.
Yeah, basically. Like a factory which is already built is basically accumulated labor.
Then you said like living labor is used to work this. Like, I'm not sure what you mean by that.
So basically, so capital, so what that says is that capital is not just accumulated labor. Like accumulated labor is not necessarily capital. It becomes capital when it uses living labor, so basically workers, to like preserve and multiply itself. When capital, like accumulated labor, becomes capital when it, like, how do I explain this better?
Right, so like it becomes capital once living labor is utilizing it?
Not necessarily. It becomes capital when living, like it's used to like preserve and multiply itself, basically make profit by like wage
It's
labor.
only capital if it's meant to produce profit.
And if it does it through wage labor.
Okay, I see.
Because
So
before
like
that, it's just like the object that it is.
The thing I don't understand though is, like, for example, accumulated labor, like in the
Mhm.
immediate economic process, like how is the fact that capital is accumulated labor relevant?
Well, because I don't know. I guess that's just what capital is, accumulated labor ultimately.
Because it doesn't seem like the fact that it's accumulated labor is really relevant for the actual economic process. Apart from that, we do accumulate labor for future production, and that is essentially, and we can do that more and more as the wealth of society grows, of course. But like, it's for future investment, and like it's explained by Niels Carnaby in his book. But it's essentially, we can accumulate labor to make it easier in the future, like better
Yeah.
living standards and so on. But of course, we have to sacrifice our current
Our
needs and demands
Yeah.
to be able to do such. That's something he says, but like, okay, so that's. But it doesn't seem that the fact that capital is accumulated labor is relevant to the economic process, like as it is really then.
Why not? Like,
I
I'm
mean,
not
the
sure.
immediate economic process, like immediate production to
Mhm.
serve needs, it's not really relevant.
I mean, if you like use a tractor, it's accumulated labor basically.
Yeah, but like the fact that it was made by workers isn't really relevant to the production, to the farming process.
Well, no.
Okay.
No, why?
Okay, so then we got that understood. That's something that I tried to get on common ground with.
Because you have well, no, never mind.
And then it was essentially when this is used combined with wage labor for profit that this becomes capital. I am. Well, then you have to determine what profit is in that case.
The extraction of surplus value from the worker's labor.
And what is surplus value then?
So basically, let's say a rich guy has like a factory. So
Okay.
he pays so let's say like he produces, I don't know, chairs or something. He produces chairs.
Yeah.
So basically he has the raw materials for the chairs.
Mm-hmm.
He has like the components to build them. And then but he doesn't build them himself, right? So he hires workers to build the chairs for him.
Yeah.
So basically, let's say the like raw materials of one chair cost like $2, and he pays the worker, I don't know, $3 or like $4 in a day for like
Okay.
working to produce that chair. So, and let's say he sells the chair for $8. So basically, the value of the raw material of the chair and of the amount of money he paid for the worker's labor power comes to 6, but he sold the chair for 8. So where does this bonus value of $2 come from? Well, basically the answer that Marx gives is that it's value created by the worker, but which isn't paid to him. So basically, the worker would like work for a certain part of like the building that chair. He would work a part of it, get paid, but at a certain point he wouldn't get paid anymore, and that value would go directly into the hands of the rich guy.
I mean,
Is this like clear? Does this make sense?
I am kind of understanding, although it excludes the process, like more efficient production of chairs and like that part. But I'll see what I can work with this example. So the excess in this situation would come from that people demand, like they want this type of chair. more than how much the capitalist paid for the production process.
I mean, I don't agree.
And then you would also find the issue here of why does the capitalist pay $4?
Okay. So I don't agree that, well, first of all, I'd like to say that the value, like I said, value and price are not the same thing. Market, like supply and demand, has an effect on the price of the object, but not necessarily on the value. Like, in real life, you never, like, the value is more of an abstraction to, like, make sense of things, but in real life, you only encounter prices of things. So, the idea is that even if the price drops because of, like, I don't know, demand and supply, the capitalist would still make a profit unless he really sold his things for really, really cheap, in which case he would be making a loss and he would go out of business, right?
I mean, I'm kind of thinking here. So, I mean, I personally don't think that supply and demand is this huge universal determiner of price. I think, like, price is essentially how much. It's essentially a way to determine needs and demand within society.
I disagree.
It's essentially a form of expression of that. Now, the process in which price is formed might not be efficient, especially, and you can have different like forms of production, like for profit or for need, and they have different incentives and whatever that can affect, of course, the price mechanism. But like, I mean, that's a disagreement on value. But like the more important question I had, like, is really like, because the core here is that workers are underpaid apparently.
Mm-hmm.
But why does the capitalist pay the amount to the workers that he does?
He pays the workers basically because if he doesn't, the worker cannot buy anything and cannot, like, survive. So he's forced to pay the worker a minimum amount of money so that the worker can survive and reproduce himself and his family, so that there can be another generation of workers to come after the worker himself or whatever.
I mean, that sounds like how a capitalist would work within a... If the capitalist managed the entire economy, but now the capitalist is one business, or like a few businesses, and then really like the wage that you pay your workers is not really that relevant in terms of what you produce and how much you're gonna receive. And like, I mean, I think that there must be like, because the capitalist essentially pays the minimum that labor would be valued by society.
Yeah.
So,
well,
online,
yeah.
think of it like a bunch of workers, they're all working with different forms of capital and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, different efficiencies. So the worker that gets the least reward from that is as a result of the least giving capital, or the least giving means of production. Sorry, I know you don't agree with the definition of capital here. Okay, the least giving means of production. That essentially sets the basis for which labor is valued also in the other more efficient capital, or means of production rather.
Okay, so I don't think the worker's wage is determined by like the efficiency of the means of production he uses at all, because the wage comes from. So basically, how I see it, the work of the labor power of the worker is a commodity itself. It's something that the capitalist buys, but it reproduces. It creates value. That's what makes it unique. So what we have here is that the capitalist pays the worker to basically create value for him. But the thing is, the worker's wage is not dependent on the efficiency of the means of production. It's only dependent on basically what the capitalist pays him, because the money the capitalist gives to the worker is money that he already has. It's not money that comes from selling the objects themselves.
Yeah, but like you usually have a standard or normal wage, which the capitalists would use to calculate how much they would pay their workers.
Yeah.
You have to figure out how that standard wage is determined. Because if the labor, because that would in turn show how much labor is valued in our society, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Then the excess that more efficient capital produces would become the profit.
I don't agree with that. Like I said, I think profit comes from a part of the working day in which the worker isn't paid and where the value created by the work goes directly to the capitalist.
I mean, I think of it more like labor and capital, but like laboring with capital is necessary for value to be created, but capital creates more value because it's more efficient.
Well, if you compare
capital is
two
more
different
efficient,
capitals, one will be more efficient and will create more value, but it still requires labor to create value. Capital doesn't create value by itself.
well, say that when industry gets more and more automized, but that's not relevant. Okay, so the thing is, you need both labor and capital to produce something of value.
Yeah.
So both interact in creating this. And
I mean,
so the value generated by labor and capital combined minus the value of labor in society, which is the minimum, like capital, that the least efficient capital that is produced, the labor working with that, is how you determine the lowest wage, or whatever you would say. Like, this is how you determine the value of labor in society generally. Now the excess after this would be what becomes profit.
I mean, but where does this profit come from?
The profit essentially comes from that the subjective value that people determine of the goods and services produced by labor and capital combined is higher than the value of labor generally in society.
I disagree. I think that if well, first of all, I don't think that it's capital and labor which create value, which create profit. It really is the act of labor working on capital which creates value. Capital, like I said, doesn't create any value by itself. The tractor won't do anything if there's nobody in it. Labor is required to further value. Labor is the only way to really create value. Sure, like I don't know, a machine will create more value in a certain amount of time than I don't know, your hands. but the machine was created by labor. Everything comes down to labor. The capital itself is a product of labor, and labor is the only way to add value.
Well,
And okay.
we kind of concluded earlier that, I mean, the fact that the tractor was made by, well, it was contributed to by labor, or made by labor, is not relevant for the immediate economic production. Then I kind of lose myself. I've been up for a while.
Well, I mean, what do you mean by immediate, like, economic?
Like, so for the economic process right now, practically, the fact that the tractor was made by a fully automized factory, if it appeared out of the blue, or if it was made with very basic and unproductive forms of capital and a lot of labor, is not relevant at all. It isn't relevant to the production process where it came from.
Well, not
how
really,
it was produced.
It is relevant to the final price or value of the product created by the tractor.
Not really.
Isn't it relevant to the overall conversation anyway, though? The fact that labor is what produces all capital in the first place?
I think
that kind of is, because it isn't really like relevant in practical application.
I think it is, though.
I mean, it's relevant in practical application for future production, but for any like historical thing, like the fucking hammer I'm working with was made by some workers in a shop yesterday. That's not relevant at all. Like, it's in terms of future production, sure, but in terms of past accumulated labor, it's not relevant at all.
I mean, I think it is relevant because you have to buy that hammer.
I mean, sure, but you can go back to like the value of what you produce is still determined by how society and the market determines it to be valued, not how much you paid for it. Like, if you realize that people do not deem your product as valuable as how much you paid to produce it, then you're gonna realize that, yeah, shit, I'm gonna have to go back on this. I'm gonna have to lose money.
I mean, I don't agree that like values are determined by like society's needs or something like that. But because, like, let's say you have like a loaf of bread costs like $2 and a diamond will cost like way more. The loaf of bread has a much more important used value than a diamond, yet it costs way less.
I mean, now you're going more in terms of like practical, objective, like survival. The diamond is more valued because people psychologically believe that it is more valued.
I disagree. I think the diamond is more valuable because more labor was put into it.
I mean, that's not necessarily the case either. Yet still people are gonna sell the diamond for much more.
I mean, how is it not necessarily the case?
I mean, you could find a diamond on the ground.
Yes, but if you found all diamonds on the ground, they wouldn't be valuable.
I mean, yeah, a value is diamonds is, well, almost a spot market, so that's true. If there's a ton of diamonds, then people are gonna think, well, it's so easy to get the diamond, and people are gonna basically be able to, prices go down on spot markets due to supply and demand. then I don't agree that it applies to every market, but spot markets like, yeah, diamonds, they do have that problem.
Alright, well,
I mean, it's still subject to...
I think
It's still
we just
subjective. Like, the
disagree
only
here.
the only like practical value is subjective, like in the end.
Well, there's sort of an
Yeah, the
alternate
only,
subjectivity here.
like I said, the use value is subjective, but the exchange value of the diamond, like, or which corresponds more or less with the price, is determined by, like I said, labor. That's why you have cars or diamonds or things that are completely useless to the average worker, which cost way more than things which are of vital necessity to most of the people.
I mean, of course. For example, you have a branding today which creates some form of demand, and then people are of course gonna try and sell their cars at a price at which they would regain all of the money they spent on it. But if there is no demand for that product at that price, then they won't be able to sell it and will be forced to lower the price.
Yeah, they'll be forced to lower it, but if the price goes too low, capital will like basically leave the industry of producing cars because it's not profitable to go to other industries. It's like I can't really explain all of this right now. It's like with all the like market fluctuations and like competition and like movement of capital right now, because I don't really remember what I read too well. But I mean, Marx pretty much explained all of this in his book.
Okay. Well, the thing is, like, if people don't find the need for something and essentially like they don't find demand or need for something to the point where it becomes unprofitable for someone to produce it, to the point where essentially you don't get any access over the societal value of labor in that industry, then yeah, sure, people are not going to find it worth spending labor and money basically on serving a need that people don't really have at willing to pay that the price to produce it. That's kind of like society correcting. Well, it's basically the market correcting itself based on the cost to produce stuff.
I mean, the market correcting itself does have some pretty big consequences, like people losing their jobs because one branch of industry becomes not profitable, and like we're just the market correcting itself also leads to like creases because overproduction, and it's not profitable anymore because you just made so much of things. So then the whole system just goes and like into a crash and has to start over again. Like capitalism, like the fact that supply and demand like controls everything like that creates something called the anarchy of the market, which leads to like problems basically.
I mean, most of the market is more complicated than supply and demand.
Yeah, there's also competition.
I mean,
no.
there are like supply and demand. It works for spot markets, but when you start like considering individual adaptations, like all those kinds of things, then it starts getting kind of difficult to use that format. And like when people start interacting with each other, like different businesses buying stuff from each other, and they start interacting, then they shape their goods and everything. Like it becomes a giant social network. Not to mention that like these spot markets have massive variations, so we don't see like cycles of this year we go for this good and because it's profitable. Oh no, we went for this good too much. It became unprofitable. Next year you don't go for it. Then the next year after you go full on with it again because there's no supply. Like markets are, it's more complicated than just some supply and demand and some competition. Like markets are filled with cooperation as well. Like that, you know, phones and stuff, they contain like patents and things from, and the jointly produced parts from all kinds of businesses collaborating, like even competing mobile brands do that. Like
with components that were
the market
created
is
by the government as well, which is a funny little fact.
Yeah, that too, but like the market is so much more complicated than just supply and demand. And
Well, it is, but how I see it, it's just, well,
like it's basically like you base it off some, basically the economy of basically the 1700s and early 18, and like the shift to the 1800s, like Adam Smith, like the economy does not work the same way anymore.
does it not? Like, it is different, definitely, and it does have different mechanisms and things, but it's still like
international trade was dominant.
Basic principles.
Like international trade, like the goods that were really subject to any form of like capitalist productions, they were like standardized goods of a set quality type. Like not like anything specially adapted to another business or to specific consumers or anything like that. And there weren't really as much of social relations between businesses trying to work with collaboration instead of just switching partners and stuff like that. Like that hadn't really developed.
Like I don't see how the laws of the market don't apply today anymore.
Like they do apply, but the thing is, the major thing in the economy is not just some simple spot markets anymore. Like the economy is much more social in nature than it was back then.
Yeah, production is social, and the appropriation of the product is individual. That's a contradiction.
I mean, like social as in psychological.
Well,
like the economy is much more psychological now than it was back then. Like a spot market, it works like through price mechanisms basically, and supply and demand, and they will meet at equilibrium. Like even if it meets at equilibrium, the price will vary if the average is on 100 between 50 and 150. Also, today you have to adapt products all the time to your consumer, to your fellow business that you're collaborating with. Like, and businesses collaborate with a lot of other businesses, so you have to do this a lot, and you have to have insight in others' production. Like, everything is so adapted, and through this you also get human relations between people. So that's also now a factor in the economy. Like, everything is so much more complicated now than it was back then, with a few spot markets on, say, spices, for example.
I mean, yes, it's more complicated, but that doesn't mean it's not, like, that doesn't mean it's entirely different at all.
No, sure, like the availability of a product and the demand for it, of course, is going to play a role, but the economy is so much more psychological, social, like interactions between human beings, not just some anonymous interaction based on a price mechanism.
I mean, I disagree with that, but I mean, I would like to change subjects here. I think we're kind of done here.
Yeah. Sure. Let's just be done for now.
Yeah.
I'm like, I think I've been up for, what is it now? Yeah, good at least. Wait, I can't think. Maybe. Well, I'm in Sweden, so it's almost 5:30 in the morning by this point.
Oh my god. Okay.
So are we done?
I mean,
I'm sure
if
we
you
could
want to.
move to another subject, or we could just
Yeah,
move on.
I'm up to moving to different subjects and stuff.
All right.
I'll move to anything.
But you guys don't want to like. You guys want to keep talking?
I mean, sure.
Sure. I would like to hear from you, Madeline.
Oh well. I was about to say this at some point in that whole dialogue. To me, it's just important that that surplus value, that profit, is in the hands of the workers. So to me, it's just
Yeah, I
important that the
agree.
capital that they're using is owned by them. That's all. That's my input.
I mean, that's.
Well, that's a different debate, but yeah.
Yeah, that is a different debate from the actual ownership and stuff like that. The results of, well, excess value, as to say, produced by capital. How, and the income generated from that, how that is supposed to be organized. Because, like, right now we have it as a private income source for the person who owns the capital. That it doesn't, like...
Right.
That could theoretically be different.
That's one of our fundamental objections to the whole capitalist system.
Like, the main objection to the capitalist system is that it is undemocratic.
Well,
That's
one of
like
them, yeah.
the core of a socialist tradition is that the capitalist production has failed to satisfy the needs and demands of the working class.
Right, because capitalist
not-
production isn't based on need; it's based on the profit.
That's
of
like
the owner.
that's like the core of the socialist tradition. Then, like, people have expanded on that, and like Marx, for example, created like an entire world view that kind of matched reaching like the ideals of this kind of reaction to capitalist production failing.
Sort of.
Pretty much.
I mean, I don't.
Then how we actually like reach these ideals of a more democratized economy, for example, like that's basically also, and how that economy is gonna look like. That's why we have so many different forms of socialism.
Right. Along
Like,
with the
for-
fact that like there's different conditions in different places at different times.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's sort of the lens of Marxist analysis. And dialectical materialism is the material conditions, so
Yeah, those are kind of essential. Phew. Okay, I'm kind of losing myself a lot, to be honest.
do you want to go?
I mean, I like talking politics, and it's always interesting to hear. So I feel like staying.
All right. Well,
Alright.
I'm going to like wrap up at some point, obviously, but
Yeah, you can wrap up when you want to.
do we
Okay,
have
so-
any other like topics?
Hold
to
on.
discuss?
So we were discussing. We got into the subject of democratization of the economy.
Mhm.
So, Madeline, I'm gonna say Madeline. That's the right
Yeah.
way to say it. Okay, so what does Stalin here think of the strive towards equal purchasing power?
Well, I think that he would benefit from your explanation of it.
Yeah.
Okay, so essentially, purchasing power is your ability to exert demand on the economy. So essentially, how much money you got. So essentially, we should strive towards getting as much wealth and income equality as possible.
No, I disagree with that.
Why don't you think we should do that?
Well, like I said, I think this ties in with my previous position. I think that value comes from labor, and that people should be paid based on the value they create.
Okay, I'll ask you this. Do you think that production is steered by the demand exerted on the market?
I mean, if in capitalism, yeah, sort of. But
Okay.
socialism wouldn't operate the same way.
Okay, so if that's how it works in capitalism, at least, do you think that while we are within the capitalist framework, which we are likely gonna be for quite some time, regardless of if you want revolution or not, that we strive towards equality of purchasing power?
Under capitalism, yeah, I think it's definitely a good thing, because like the whole voting with your wallet thing, that like right wingers like to use this argument, kind of just falls apart, because rich people have way more purchasing power and have like a way bigger impact on the economy than poor people, which I think is, I don't know, unfair, I guess.
Yeah, voting
I
with your
mean, of
dollar is
course it is
pure
unfair.
ideology. Yeah.
Yeah, but I agree that equal purchasing power would be at least better under capitalism.
So then the question becomes, would in a socialist society there be ways of exerting demand on the economy?
Hmm. Well, yeah, there would.
What would those ways be?
Well, like, I haven't thought this out super well yet, but how I see it, well, first of all, I would just like to clarify that how I view socialism, it would be like a planned economy, right?
Yeah.
So, how demand would be taken into account, it could, well, I think demand for certain things can be predicted pretty well, like food, or I don't know, houses, or like clothing. These
How
things,
do you, how do you determine which kind of food people want?
well, you can, well, like I think you ask people, like, you could have like massive surveys to ask people what they want, and then have a planned economy produce it, and like have also input. Like, let's say you're producing a lot of, like, I don't know, potatoes, and people want carrots. They could, like, input this into the system, so that you like redirect more land towards carrots, which I think is plausible in a planned economy.
Well, people kind of change what they want to eat like every day, and like they always change it. So I'm not sure how you're gonna manage to keep up with that.
Well, you don't have to, like, first of all, lots of things should be produced. Like, yeah, like they wouldn't be like only potatoes and carrots. Like, there would be a lot of things in the stores, how I see it, if production is advanced enough. And like, it would be in a highly advanced society, similar to capitalist society, I think. But I think this, especially on food, this is kind of like not the most important thing, because
Yeah.
the priority should be to have people eat and not like, decide what they
I mean,
want to eat. But like in other sectors, like I don't know, consumer like commodities or objects, like I don't know, bicycles or cars. Um,
yeah, then you
like
start getting into issues when you're moving over to consumer goods.
hmm?
Then you start running into issues. Like, for example, in a planned economy, how would you know that people would enjoy smartphones so much?
Well,
Would you
you
dare
ask them.
invest in it?
I mean,
How
how I
many
see
people
it,
were into smartphones in the beginning?
well, yeah, you would invest in it.
Like, it's not as easy to determine demand. Like, if you have it like uh, people like, how do they exert this demand? Like you say, through surveys. Sure, your surveys are gonna work to an extent, like but people are still gonna change their minds a bit. So like you're still gonna have problems in terms of in the actual stores, and people are gonna that's where you really get to have demand exerted onto the economy, right? So still, like, to go back to the purchasing power thing, wouldn't it also be desirable also in that kind of society to have equal purchasing power?
Um, well, I think everyone should have the same impact on the economy, but not everyone should make the same amount of money necessarily. Like, I don't think they have to be equal.
I mean, basically, that's like saying that if we make a comparison to political life, that's like saying that you don't really want any excess, like, but the votes can vary a little in how much they influence political life. And then we have like in terms of purchasing power, like, sure, you're never gonna realistically and practically be able to distribute it 100% equally, but it's something to strive for. It's like our ideal.
Well, under socialism, like there wouldn't like inequality between people and how much purchasing power they have would be pretty small compared to what we have now. Like, so
Yeah,
yeah, there would be deviations and not everyone would have exactly the same, but it would be a lot more similar than like the purchasing power of a capitalist versus a worker.
yeah. I remember I read somewhere like, because the Soviet Union was like really equal in terms of that. Like I read somewhere that Sweden during the 70s managed to reach an income equality around the same as the Soviet Union,
Hmm.
which is pretty based for still having private ownership being dominant. Don't you think?
Sure, but that
So that
doesn't
means
mean
that even within that framework, you can reach a situation in which purchasing power is fairly equal. And so a democratization of the economy, since production is steered by demand, since you have to serve demand to be able to make a profit.
I mean, but the goal is not to make a profit.
I mean, like in capitalism, the goal is to make a profit. So essentially, by equalizing purchasing power, you people exert more and more equal amounts of demand on the economy. Thus, even in a capitalist production, the steering of production becomes more and more democratic.
Um, yeah, but I
Okay.
don't like.
So, like, I don't really see, like, do you think we should, like, do you think we should stop at some point trying to reach equal purchasing power, or, like, do you think we shouldn't do that?
I don't think equal purchasing power is necessary under socialism at all, though. That's the thing. Like,
I think
it's nice if you have a market, but if you don't have market like mechanisms, I don't see the point of having equal purchasing.
I mean, in any system in which you are trying to steer production, in which production is controlled, or, well, guided, as to say, by demand, then the equality of exerting that demand is essential to try and expand the democracy within the economy. Doesn't matter who owns or who manages the production. Like, in any economy in which you're trying to do that, and the people's ability to do that, it has to be equal to exert equal influence.
But like, even then, why? Like, how I see it, I don't see the main problem with capitalism being it undemocratic in the workplace. How I see it, it's that it's exploitative, which is why it's in the interests of working people to like create a new system. And how I see it, democracy is more of a means than an end in order to get higher living conditions for people. So like, I don't really see the like a democratic like equal purchasing power thing, how you see, as being necessary, because if there's no exploitation, there's no real need to like have every single person have an like impact on the general societal demand.
I mean, I think that it is important that we make sure that the economy is guided in the direction that the general populace wanted to, the masses wanted to.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So, if you have an economy in which people are able to exert demand, which you have to have an economy to do if you try to satisfy people's demands, which is most people's goal with the economy, then if you want every person to be able to have an equal say in, these are my needs, these are my demands, this is what I want to get from the economy, then you should have equal purchasing power.
Well, let's say someone works more than someone else in a socialist economy. The person who works more, I don't see a problem with them having more impact on the economy itself, because they put more labor into it.
I mean, I don't really think, I think we should have an economy based on what people, like, ideally, the economy is supposed to meet every single person's demands to the greatest extent possible. And an unequal distribution of the ability to demand in the economy to determine what is produced then creates a kind of unfair thing. Like, I think it's unfair. I can't ask myself again, fuck.
I'm bad at like making like arguments on the go like this, but
Oh yeah, I remember now. So you mentioned like someone getting more for like your work. Yeah, the thing is with equal purchasing power is that you will never be able to realistically achieve equal purchasing power because, well, as long as you have capital and labor income, because that's essentially how that's necessary for our economy to function. But we should always strive to make this as democratic as possible in how we determine what societal needs are, which are determined through the demand exerted by the populace. And if now some people have less influence over it because they work less or they aren't as capable of working more, or they don't have the crazy education or whatever, then I mean, I think that their needs are still just as important as anyone else's needs.
I mean, in this frame, with the economy serving to fill people's needs, I do think socialism is better than social democracy, because social democracy still has capitalists who drive the economy not to fill people's needs, but to make profit.
I mean, you're talking about social democracy as a policy regime right now, I think. But like ideologically, social democracy strives towards socialism, as in a completely democratic society. But in terms of for profit production, then if say we conduct an experiment with need-based production in an economy, a socialized production as well, and say that we have for-profit production as well competing with it, and the government ensures that they are on equal footing, right? The one which succeeds the best at meeting people's demand in this case should be the one to be kept in the economy.
Oh boy, okay, so this is kind of a weird example, because if you have an economy based on profit and not on needs,
like need-based production, like you ignore the profit motive and stuff like that,
mm-hmm.
like there are two different ways of measuring and meeting demand. But
Yeah, but like I said, I think need-based production is better to meet demand.
I mean, what if the material conditions were to change and that it wasn't as efficient as profit-based production then?
I mean, I think it's the opposite. I think before, production based on needs was not feasible at all, so that basically the profit motive was really just the what the material conditions gave, because that's what was needed. But we've arrived in an epoch in society where this profit motive does not do as well as the need motive, if that makes sense.
I mean, are you sure that is universal for all industries?
Well, maybe not for all of them, but
so
definitely as a whole.
Profit production in those industries where we see that it is more efficient at serving people's demands?
Sure, why not? But I just highly doubt that.
Yeah, but
many of these industries will exist in the first place.
On a functioning market, like the production that best serves people's needs is the one that is going to be the most successful.
Sure, but when you have an
Okay,
economy
so
based on profit, it will create inequality,
hold
which
on. So if you have a government that makes sure that the competition between different organizations of production, for profit and say need-based, that these can compete on equal grounds, and if need-based production does win out in this situation, then it would of course be the one that best serves people's actual demands, and then it should be the one we focus on. If then profit-based wins out in this competition, then shouldn't we make sure that then we should make sure that this is the form of production that we have, since it best serves people's demand, especially if we have a very equal level of purchasing power. Then we'd find that it is a larger representant of the working class and also the masses generally, serving their demands. And of course, this evaluation has to be done within all industries if we are going to reach the optimal economy, as to say.
I mean, to me, it sounds like you're like describing sort of the Chinese approach to economy. Well, it's true. China literally like uses the scientific method to like try out policies. They'll do something in one region. They'll try like the policy in a single region, and if it works well, they'll apply it to the whole country. Or like that's the basic idea.
I mean that's pretty. That's pretty damn
China
good.
has has had for a very long time a very high like economic increase. Like the economy is constantly increasing massively in China, but this has problems with it as well. Like I don't see how you can have a profit-based economy that doesn't like I don't see how a profit-based economy can be as efficient to like for needs as a need-based economy.
I mean, I haven't really looked into it, but I think like the practical application of both and the competition on a market that is fair, guaranteed by the state, of course, should be capable of determining which is best, regardless of what theoretical approach we might end up at.
I mean, I guess an argument could be made for that. Like, I do think that the Chinese method of using the like scientific method to like see and like test policies is actually a pretty good way of doing things. I think maybe it could be done under a planned economy, but like, is this what you're like trying to say? To like test things to see which one works out better?
Yeah, and like one of the things is like because Marxism, Leninism seems a bit dogmatic with the socialized production and stuff like that. Like, I want to get more like if we were to see that profit-based production is more efficient at serving our needs, then we shouldn't be afraid to resort to it.
I mean, sure, I agree, but the thing is, I don't think profit-based production is better at like for demand.
Yeah, I mean, I am not opposed to trying to implement more need-based or socialized production. I mean, I am a socialist too, after all.
Well, I mean, this is really case by case basis, but like, you look at healthcare in the U.S., which is made for profit, and like the results are like horrendous compared to
Yeah,
like for need healthcare.
yeah, I know.
Some things are just like off the table. Like most of the world agrees. Like, yeah, do not do this based on profit, and medicine is one of
hmm
them.
But like how I see it, like I don't see socializing everything as I think it would actually really help for most of it. Like, but yeah, I guess you could make a market socialist argument, kind of. But like how I see it, even if you have a market in a certain region, at a certain point it will become more productive to go for a socialized approach, for a need approach, because eventually like the contradictions of a profit market approach will like what's that word again, they will eventually slow down production. Like eventually everything will be socialized, because eventually socializing things for need will be the most efficient way of production, how I see it. I
I
guess
mean,
you could make like, let's say an industry is more, in the present day, it would be better at meeting needs through profit. Well, I don't like, maybe it could be a good idea, but I think that eventually even that industry will become more efficient under a need approach, because of the at a certain stage the productive forces just become developed to the point where like the profit motive is kind of irrelevant.
I mean, sure, if the material conditions develop that to a point at
hmm
which it is more efficient to socialize it, then of course there is absolutely no reason in the world to why we shouldn't do that if it ends up meeting people's demands better.
Well, I think we kind of agree here, because like how I see it, I just think that socializing everything would be better right now, but like yeah, if your economy is underdeveloped, you do need a stage of like capitalism or markets. Like in Russia, you had Lenin like made the NEP, the New Economic Policy, which was because basically they didn't have a productive base to build socialism. So he went through a state capitalist stage in order to like increase the productive forces, and then well, Stalin became the general secretary and like made the 5-year plans. But like it's kind of the point. Like you can't just go into socialism. You have to pass through. Well, not necessarily, but historically speaking, the countries have to go through like as a whole. The world has to go through a capitalist stage before going into socialism. China also did this, and with the new democracy, they also had like capitalism under the control of a dictatorship of the proletariat, though, which I think can be a good approach depending on the material conditions. But it's only a good approach having like markets and limited forms of capitalism if the government is controlled by the workers. Because if it isn't, it leads to like basically what we have in the US or like all the capitalist countries.
I mean,
Right.
the approach I essentially gave you is the social democratic approach to how we should look at the economy, like, the goal isn't, like, having specifically this form of production or something. Like, the goal is meeting people's demands and
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I
meeting
agree with
people's
that,
needs.
actually. I just don't think that the social democratic way of doing it is the best way, I guess.
I mean, the social, ideologically, like, I always need to make this distinction, because people have gotten into their heads this idea of social democracy as a policy regime that is essentially welfare capitalism. Like, just like people in the US essentially thought of communism as the policy regime of the Soviet Union. Like, it's not the ideology itself, like the ideals. Like, social democracy as an ideology is not the same as welfare capitalism.
Yeah.
So, like, the approach social democracy as an ideology has to the economy is essentially, we should try to serve people's needs, and we should try to shape the economy as to make sure that people can exert their needs in a more democratic way. So, for example, one of the proposed ways is through equal purchasing power, or more equal purchasing power. And, like,
Yep.
then we practically try out and let these different forms of organizing production compete with each other, and we see which ones are the most successful at meeting people's demands. So we use these. Because
I guess,
the
but
important thing isn't, like, who actually owns production. The important thing is the distribution. Who is
but I
how
don't
people
think
are able to exert their demand to get their needs satisfied.
this method wouldn't work under present material conditions. Like, I don't think it would at all. Because, like, the current governments and the ruling class won't just, like, let you do these things.
I mean, sure, you have to, like... I mean, an essential part before you try to tackle... I mean, before you can meddle too much in the economy, it's essential is that you equalize purchasing power more. That is a redistribution of wealth through, for
But
example, welfare state. Because when there is a small elite that holds most of the purchasing power, then those will have most of the ability to exert demand, yeah, even though they don't, which hurts the economy, but they also can use this purchasing power to create propaganda machines and to lobby politicians, for example.
exactly, but
So it's
I don't
an
think
issue
these
of purchasing power there too. And as shown historically, we have seen that we can move more towards further redistribution. Like, the more we redistribute, like, the weaker they get. So it's like a positive spiral, even if it can fail at times, of course. But it's a struggle.
Alright, I think we can close here.
Alright. Well,
I'm kind of tired.
Yeah, me too. It's 6 in the morning now.
I think we all are, but that was
I've been
great.
here since 2.
Wow.
I'm sorry that, like, I made you wait.
Don't be sorry about it.
Okay. But yeah, so there we go, guys. The SockerDem and the anarchist and the tanky together. There you
I
go.
didn't even hear the anarchist.
Well, yeah,
Sad
I
face.
mean, it was more like the anarchist listens to the SockerDem and the tanky talking.
I mean, like, the real, like, the more... The actual discussions where we disagreed more, that came in the beginning, we kind of just didn't really get anywhere with those, but well.
Oh, well, indeed.
Yeah.
We've been here for
I
4
don't
hours.
personally I don't think voice chat is like optimal. usually.
Yeah.
It's just better for content purposes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Content purposes are important too in the age of the internet.
Yeah.
But we have any final memes, guys?
Seize the means of production. But yeah, SockerNisse, you sound like a dentist, to be honest. Like,
I don't buy into like some things like dictatorship of the proletariat and
okay.
that's
We
and
can debate that some other time.
I don't really like I don't think that we do know the future development of society. Like some Marxists come and claim like, yeah, communism is inevitable. I'm like, yeah, or I'm not sure about that. Like, sure, you can make that prediction, but you don't know for sure. And basing your ideology on reaching that ideology and your supposed development to reaching that society is kind of like, it's not really desirable. Like, my goal is more like, we should focus on what the practical needs of the working class and society as a whole is, and we should satisfy those. And the best way to do that is by democratizing the economy.
I mean, I think Marxists agree with that. I mean, real Marxists don't want to establish communism. They see it as like something that will happen eventually, but it's not something to like, they don't see it like as a practical thing to implement.
Yeah,
but yeah, let's not get into a debate.
Yeah, let's not get more into this. It's time to end it.
Time to save it to the next time. I'm gonna piss
Alright.
myself if we don't, so.
Yeah, I'm up to doing this again.
Huh?
Yeah, me too.
I mean, I'll try to read more of this fucking book.
Did you say you're not doing this again, or you are?
I am doing this again.
Okay,
I need to
good.
read more of the book to get more in depth on it.
Alright.
I need to read Capital.
More. I need to read Capital. That's a heavy book. It's like, I don't know, 800 pages or something.
Yeah,
right?
it's such a big book. It's pretty scary, but I'll eventually get to it.
This book that I'm having in my hand is just like 316 pages.
Yeah.
And the other here is like, I don't know. And I'm not even much of a reader. So.
I have a hard time concentrating to read.
I think we all do in the digital age now.
Yeah.
My attention span is very bad.
Autocracy.
That's what the capitalists want. They want that. They're shortening our attention spans on purpose.
Yeah, I know. It's a conspiracy by the bourgeoisie.
I mean, the bourgeoisie are gonna die due to the rise of the internet anyways. Well, not actually die.
Okay.
Not actually
maybe.
die.
Again, next time.
Yeah, next time.
Yeah, next time.
We'll talk about
to be
continued. Yes, but yeah. Alright.
Alright.
See you around, guys.
Bye.
Yeah. Okay, see you all.
Alright. Based. Cool.